Thank you. Thank you. My guest tonight is John Cleese, or Cleese, or Cheese. And perhaps he will explain that or leave it at that, but I'm serious. Who is as intelligent and presentable and charming a madman, as they say in England, as you'd ever want to meet. Mr. Cleese, or Cleese, comes by his madness professionally, you could say, because he is one of a group of 6 English writers, artists, performers who call themselves Monty Python's Flying Circus. I hope they aren't unheard of to you. Don't ask me why they are called that. The chances are that you have seen the Monty Pythons either on their TV show, you may be addicted to it. It's now running on more than 100 PBS stations, or you've seen their films, or live appearances, or books, or whatever. Even so, you may not be absolutely sure what it is you have seen when you have seen them. So, there's a little test for you. You might try to complete the following sentence. The Monty Pythons are A, brilliantly funny, B, tasteless and funny, C, deeply satirical, D, sophomoric and inane, or E, the perfect answer to the complaint that we import too much British culture. Now, have you all finished your exams? The trouble is that I guess all those answers could be considered correct depending on who or whom you ask. The group's latest venture is a movie called The Life of Brian. You may have seen, know about it. It's a religious travesty, which is an enormous success, I expect, from the Pythons' point of view, since it seems to have offended everybody. Here is an item called the Monty Python Scrapbook. The names all run together, and there's only one S. You can make what you want of that. And it's their published version, really, or half of it is, of the script of the Monty Python. Well, it's a published version of the script of the movie, yeah. And then when you get to the end of that, everything is upside down, and you have to flip the book over and start from the other end. The book contains, however, a letter from Queen Elizabeth, the Buckingham Palace stationery, and it begins, hello, many people feel that in this day and age thinking you are a queen is somehow a dangerously lunatic idea. I'll skip some, but she said, Her Majesty then goes on to say, but not the Monty Python boys, and that is why I've always steered well clear of giving them silly awards and gongs and meaningless initials after their names, which we throw around to the idiots in the civil service for subverting any social changes that might occasionally occur to the tired minds of the witless cretins who have run this country since the war. Now, people have even suggested that Queen Elizabeth did not actually write that letter, but everything the Pythons do gets criticized, so I'm sure they're braced for that. Anyway, perhaps Mr. Cleese can clear that up for us. It's a bit of a muddle. Will you welcome, please, John Cleese? Old friend. Have a seat there. Oh. Was that all right? John is either now going to be wildly funny or occasionally funny, depending on how either of us feels. That has to be a problem for anybody in the life of or the world of wild comedy.
Oh, I find it a terrible problem. In fact, if you really want to know, this is the second chat show I've done in my life. Well, I did one in 1967. Yeah. And as a result of it, I thought I'd leave it a little, you know.
Give it a rest.
Give it a rest, so no.
Well, yes, I was told that you were impossible to get, that we would be more likely to get Greta Garbo on the show, and as luck would have it, she wanted to be on today. But it's been so hard to get you. Are you a reluctant traveler as well? Is that part of it, that you don't like to wing over to?
I don't like rushing about. You know, you come to New York for 2 weeks and you think this is lovely, because I actually lived in New York for 18 months.
Right.
Got a lot of friends, yeah. I don't know, the audience might be interested to know that I did 6 months on Broadway and half a sixpence playing opposite your wife, who was playing my sister.
That's right.
That's right.
Yes. And by the time I saw the show, you were not in it, you tell me?
Well,
and yet I clearly remember you in it.
Maybe you didn't look very hard. You know, I only had a few lines, and the lovely thing about it is that I'm the worst singer in the world, well, certainly Europe. And I was kicked out of singing classes when I was about 10, and I had to go and do extra Greek.
Yes.
And I was here in New York, and somebody said, come and audition for a Broadway musical. And I thought, this is the funniest thing ever. I thought, this is wonderful. So I went along, and they asked me to sing something, and I said, I really cannot, what's the word, handle a tune, carry a tune?
Handle or carry a tune.
Yeah. And they said, can you sing your national anthem? And I tried, and I got it wrong.
Puts you in good company.
Yeah, and a week later, they rang me up and said, will you do the part anyway? And I said, what do I do about the singing? And they said, well, it's only chorus stuff. So until you get the tune, first couple of months, just mime. And that's what I did. I stood at the back of the chorus, and everybody sang. I knew the words, and I just did that quiet. And then, after we'd been going about 3 months, I started joining in very quietly.
You let a little voice sneak into it?
Just a little,
Well,
on the notes that I was sure of.
Yeah. Well, I clearly remember you in the show, and
You're alive.
And even though you had left it by the time I saw it, that's how indelible an impression you make as a performer. My wife said you kept her sane and several other people out of town. Being out of town with a musical is not the best thing for one's mental equilibrium.
Oh, it was terrible. We lost the director after 3 weeks. You know, all these terrible horror stories that we hear in England, you know, about how tough it is in America.
Yeah.
There was a very nice director I was very fond of, and I walked in for rehearsal the 3rd week, and he was gone.
They just had it.
Never saw him again.
Now, was that ever explained to you? Was he
Nope.
just an unperson at that point?
But a terrific guy took over. I don't think he liked me much, and I don't think he thought I was any good, but he had real guts. And he came in, and he brought the thing together, and he got it right by the time we got to Broadway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who was that?
Gene Sachs.
Oh, Gene Sachs, yeah, that's right.
His
By the way,
director
getting into the movie The Life of Brian, by the way, does any of you admit to naming the group Monty Python's Flying Circus? Is there a controversy about who?
Well, yes, the problem we had of finding a good title for it was almost the worst problem we had with the whole show. You know, we had the show written on the first one, and we didn't know what to call it. And we had a whole lot of fanciful titles, like we wanted to call it a horse, a spoon, and a basin. And a basin, which I really liked. And somebody else wanted to call it Bun Wacket, Buzzard, Stubble, and Boot. Owl Stretching Time. The Toad Elevating Moment. There were all these suggestions. And one day we sat around and got very drunk, and we had to come up with a title. And somebody had already started to call it The Flying Circus. In fact, the BBC had started to call it that, and they'd started writing it in their schedules in ink, you know. So they said, well, could you call it The Flying Circus, because otherwise we have to write out new schedules. So we said, it's a nice title. And then we couldn't decide who, and we thought it might be Gwen Dibley's Flying Circus, because she'd been Michael Palin's music teacher when he was 11. And then somehow we went off Gwen Dibley. I don't know why. She could be famous, you know.
Had someone else used her name, perhaps?
No, nobody got there first.
Gwen Dibley.
And somebody came out with Monty Python, and we all fell about. And I mean, I can't explain why. We just thought it was funny that night.
Presumably you haven't been sued by anyone named that. It sometimes happens when you're...
Groucho Marx had that, didn't he? He had a character called Phineas X Flitterwaggle.
One of the most preposterous names.
That's right.
And one showed up in Corning, Iowa or somewhere and sued him.
Sued him. Second night, yeah.
Thaddeus T. Flywheel? No,
something like that, yeah.
One of them. By the way, I have read The Life of Brian's script. I don't know whether this is the shooting script or is it ex post facto or after the fact put...
It's the shooting script with a few things still left in that we actually edited by the time the movie got on the screen.
Oh, so there's a few things in here that aren't in the film?
Yes, one or two of the offensive things which we took out.
But if you just glance down the list of characters, the Virgin Mandy and Mr. Big Nose and the man further forward, and so there are many of these that are just wonderful. There's an ex-leper, which is a character, sort of a stock character these days, isn't it? And a Deadly Dirk and Pilot's Wife and a Boring Prophet. And in among Biggest Dickus and Intensely Dull Youth and Simon the Holy Man and so on, there's this wonderful mixture of character types. And then you notice that there are only, I think, 6 names. A casual observer would notice that most of the parts are played by the same people.
Well, yes, the 6 of us played a lot of them. We had what
there
we
are
called...
other people, of course.
Yes, we called our repertory company, and there were 5 of them, and they played everything. But on the previous film, the the Holy Grail. I remember the last day but one of the movie being driven to the location, and I said to the driver, I said, you've managed to sneak into a couple of scenes, haven't you? How many have you actually been in? And he said, I played 11 parts so far. And he was aiming to get it up to 15 by the end of the movie. You know, so if the driver's playing 15, we're working pretty hard.
Tell me, which way the controversy has been flowing lately, and on which side of the Atlantic is it more intense? I remember I don't know how many weeks ago it was, I heard on the radio announcement of something that sounded in its tone as if there had been an outbreak of World War II or something, and it had to do with outraged religious groups that had seen
Here in New
the
York.
film. In New York, yeah.
Yes.
I think I switched on the radio to the phrase, a vicious attack on Judaism. Now, at what point did you all sit down and decide to make this vicious attack on Judaism and Christianity and everything that everyone holds sacred? How can we talk about that?
Well, we just, after the Holy Grail, somebody suggested that it would be interesting to try and write a comedy set at the time of Christ. And you see, well, you know this, but when you start to write, you don't know where it's going to go. So you say, well, let's try this direction, and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. And we had an idea maybe that Brian was the 13th disciple, but he had a very demanding wife. And he was always late, so that, you know, he arrived 2 minutes after the water had been turned into wine, you know.
Missed everything.
And he missed everything, and that he never got to the Last Supper because his wife had friends coming round, and he was going to meet them at the garden afterwards, and he went to a club called the Garden, you know. And we tried this, and we found it just didn't work, because the moment that you got near the figure of Christ, I mean really near, it just really wasn't funny, because Christ was wise and flexible and intelligent, and he didn't have any of the things that, I mean, comedy is about envy, right, greed, malice, avarice, lust, stupidity. I remember an American, Harvey Orkin, once telling me, and he said, you know, you cannot make a comedy about St. Francis of Assisi, you know, there's nothing funny about it.
Yes, as they say, where do you go with it? To hell would be the answer. So, but, you know, even talking about religious subjects in the way we are now offends some people, and I don't know what assumptions lie behind that. One of them, of course, being that there's nothing funny about certain things. This is wrong. I can't think of anything there's nothing funny about in some sense. And same people who talk about how humor is a healing, wonderful thing, then don't want it applied to certain areas. Weird. A lot of...
I find it very difficult, but the trouble is, you know, what do you mean by religion? I mean, some of the PBS viewers, I believe, may have seen a series called The Long Search by a guy called Ronald Eyre, who made it for the BBC. And it was an investigation into 13 programs, basically into 13 religions. I think he did 3 on Buddhism. He traveled and did all the basic main religions in some detail. Judaism, Lutheranism, Catholicism. I think he even did the Church of England. I think he even found a program for that. Surprised it got in under the heading of religion, but anyway.
Maybe it was there for variety.
It's a little light relief around number 6. Yeah. And the thing about it, when he came to see this film, he said he thought it was a very religious film. And I may surprise you if I say I think it's a religious film. I think all the messages in it, in fact, are profoundly religious. But Ron Eyre did say, and I hope he won't mind my quoting him, that a lot of people that he thinks are not religious will be angry about it. And it simply depends on what you mean by religion. If you take religion to be a sort of revelatory and rather authoritarian creed, you know, in which certain things are handed down, must not be examined, must be obeyed, and there is a sort of an authoritarian structure enforcing it. If that's what you mean by religion, then I suppose it is in many ways anti-religious, but it's certainly not against Christ or anything Christ said. It is against the manifestations of certain aspects of organized religion. And I think one's entitled to criticize people.
Yes. Have you seen this kind of writing about the movie? There's a piece in the Washington Post by a man who said, I'm not going to see the movie, and I realize I can be accused of burning a book I haven't read. but I'm not going to go see a movie that makes fun of Christ. I don't need that, you know. Well,
the answer is, I would swear that as far as I'm concerned, it does not make fun of Christ at any moment.
no, in fact, well, perhaps you should explain one thing about the plot that we may have left out. Brian has the, I guess, ill luck to be born on the same night
Right.
that the three wise men are making their journey.
Right.
And they go to the wrong place. That's the triggering mechanism.
That's right. They finish up in the wrong stable.
Yeah.
Which is nice because, you know, we hear the story now of the three wise men arriving. But it's a very odd thing indeed to find three Oriental astrologers in full gear, carrying gold, into frankincense and myrrh, wandering around a cowshed at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's odd. I mean, we accept it because we've been brought up. But if you look at it that way, it's peculiar. What are they doing? You know, one of them says led by a star, and Mandy, Brian's mother, says led by a bottle more like, which is, you know, is the natural
reaction.
assumption, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any idea, or does anybody, where comedy leaves off and satire begins? Is it satire in the movie when Brian has all these followers that he definitely does not want, and they even stand outside and repeat his phrases and say, yes, oh, that's so true. And he tries to tell them, please, don't do this. I'm capsulizing, of course. And then a wonderful moment in the script says, remember, you are all individuals. And in unison, they chant, yes, we are all individuals. That must be satire, mustn't it?
I think
Have we
so.
crossed into the line?
I think so, yes. And then almost my favorite line in the movie, which never ever gets a laugh, when he says to them, you've got to work it out for yourself. And they say, yes, we've got to work it out for ourselves. And he says, yes. And then there's a pause, and they say, tell us more. And he says, no, that's the point. I got a laugh.
Yes,
It never gets a laugh in the movie.
but you redeemed it here. Wonder why that should be. You went into some legal trouble in this country, the Pythons as a group did, when in what might have been called an exercise of good intentions gone wrong, I suppose. I remember reading an account of it in the New Yorker. Briefly, I guess, Python shows were taken and cut and edited and censored some and condensed into a couple of shows that offended you. The Pythons were offended.
Well, beg your pardon. ABC came to us at one point. It's all a bit complicated because it's to do with whether copyright still, you know, whose copyright it was. And they said to us, we'd like to show some of your shows. And we said, look, we know what American network television is like, that you will want to edit them. And it's very nice of you to ask, but we really don't want them edited, so thanks very much for asking, but no. And then the crafty devils went off and got 6 shows that the BBC still owned the copyright to, which oddly enough were the 6 I wasn't in. I'd left the series by that time. And they chopped them about, and in the opinion of all the others, because I never saw the show, so I have to speak, I'm afraid, sort of hearsay, they did make pretty much nonsense of them. They left punchlines in and took the lead-up lines out, and then they left the lead-up lines in and left the punchlines out, and our fans all wrote in and said, this was a terrible show. Yeah. You know, what's happened to you? What's happened to you? Your writing has gone down the drain. And we eventually did take them to court and more or less won our point, which is that they're not entitled to cut the shows about unless we agree. Because you see, sorry, just to go on for a second, it's really nice that these shows do get shown on PBS. I mean, it might amuse some of the people watching, listening, to know that every time Monty Python goes out in New York, for example, I make £2.
2 whole pounds?
2 whole pounds. So for a series, you see, I can go out and have a really good dinner. But that's not the point. What's so nice is the fact that they can see them, and that's what they are. They're not cut about, they're not chopped about or anything. Same with Fawlty Towers. They're there.
They're just as you'd see them over there.
Yes. And my friends can see them, and a lot of... Well, PBS is not a big audience, but I gather it amounts to 2 to 3 million or something like that. There's a lot of people. Yeah. So it's lovely that they can be seen, and one doesn't want people chopping them around and taking great hunks out.
But could you make that clear to the court? Did they see any...
Yes.
Did they take comedy seriously enough to understand your point?
It just, the whole legal system won't get so cynical after a time, but the judge was a fan.
The judge was a... How well did he conceal this during the...
I thought very badly.
They're actually, it sounds like a sketch, because there was one point where everyone piled into the jury box to watch a television set.
That's right.
And the judge was laughing at something that had to do with judges. And,
Oh, that's right. There was a court scene on the box. Everyone was sitting in the court watching the court scene on the box.
Yeah. How did this finally come out?
Well,
Remember
we got our
the
injunction, and they were not allowed to put out the next compilation. They'd made an hour and a half out of 3.5-hour shows. They weren't allowed to repeat that, and they weren't allowed to put the other hour and a half out that they were planning, and the whole thing has kind of dissipated.
What was the impact the first night a Python show aired in England?
Tiny pockets of enthusiasm.
Could be detected?
Yes, but very, very tiny.
And there was no outrage? No?
No. The BBC, who were marvellous in as much as they said, they didn't know. I mean, they knew who we were because we'd been writing for David Frost 3-4 years ago, so we had a kind of track record. But they'd no idea what we were going to come up with, which was hardly surprising because we didn't either, so we couldn't describe it. But they said, go ahead and make 13 shows, which we thought was terrific. And then, when they got the shows, the first one went out at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, you know.
Not the prime time?
No, not the best time. And then they moved it to 11:30 on a Sunday night. And it was as though they had this time bomb, so they sort of pushed it quietest possible corner. And also the regional opt-outs, that's to say, if you were living in Newcastle, you didn't get it. Because the Newcastle had their local. In fact, I had a friend who was trying to watch the series, and he sat down in his hotel room in Newcastle and switched it on. And there was this hysterical start to Monty Python about this guy wandering around, being terribly boring about all the ancient monuments around Newcastle. And he watched it falling about, saying, this is real nerve to do this. It's really terrific. And what a great start to the show. And about 20 minutes in, he realized it was the regional opt-out.
It's sort of discouraging to anyone whose profession is comedy, I guess.
Well, the nicest
it makes a point.
Nicest thing anybody ever said about Python was that they could never watch the news after it. You know, you get in a certain frame of mind, and then almost anything's funny.
And one of the wonderful things about, well, that comedy writers and others appreciate is that you have solved the insoluble problem of how to end a sketch. You just stop doing it.
You don't end it.
At some point, and someone says, now for something, etc.
That's right.
Familiar phrase. Well, do you have any idea why, when an American goes to England and turns on the television set, he sees any number of things that would startle, shock, and offend here to the point that you would think the sun would not come up the next day? Why should you be different over there? That can...
I don't know, you see, Dick, and I don't know if that's really so true anymore. I think 10 years ago it was, without the slightest doubt. We had a very courageous Director General at the BBC, who, Sir Hugh Carlton Green, who was Graham Greene's brother. And he was a terrific guy. In fact, he once went on saying, when asked about offending people, that there are some people that one would wish to offend. And there was a great period of freedom.
I hope he was knighted for that. That's amazing for someone in the business.
I think they missed him out, actually, yes. But he was a great guy. What has happened since is that, you know, all these things go, right? They swing one way and swing the other. And it's definitely closed down a little. I think that they are being more cautious now. When I was over 3 years ago watching Saturday Night Live, I thought this is just as daring and inventive as anything on English television. So I think you're still living with something that's a little old.
That's right. It has changed a lot. I remember, though, there were things like frontal nudity. I think that's the funniest phrase ever invented in English television, in a drama.
What's the opposite of that? I mean...
What is the opposite?
Dorsal
You
nudity.
probably dorsal nudity, which you also have over there, I guess.
It's creeping in.
And no... But that idea that people will be offended always gets me, because you do want to say it less eloquently than your friend did, so what, or the thing you spoke of. Or how serious is offense? I mean, it isn't murder, and it doesn't usually cause people to commit suicide.
That's right, and it's a form of censorship. If people say, oh, excuse me, I've been offended. Sorry, you can't do that. Well, I see an awful lot on television the whole time that I find offensive. I mean, we had a program called Stars on Sunday, where all the most lovable of the most lovable singers came on and sang hymns. You know, now I
Sounds just awful.
I just thought it was punishable. But everybody thought this, you know, a lot of people thought this was religion, and it sent them off to dinner with a good warm glow, you know. Well, to me it was offensive, but I wouldn't try and stop them. And as a friend of mine pointed out, you know, I mean, we have a flourishing organization in Britain. It's one of the most forward-looking organizations, I think, to be found in the United Kingdom, called the Flat Earth Society. You know,
There are still flat earthers?
quite a few.
Really?
And they feel very strongly that the Earth is flat,
Yes.
and that there's a lot of extremely hostile and offensive propaganda about it. But as my friend said, you can't change the words of the song to "Across the World in 80 Days" just to please them. You know, at a certain point, you have to say to people, well, if that's what you believe, that's fine. But I'm sorry, we're entitled to make comment about it. If you don't like it, please just switch it off. Because there's a lot around that offends us, and we're not trying to stop you. You know, the world seems to be divided into people who are what I would call, to be insulting, the anal retentives, who are running around trying to control everyone so that they don't get upset, you know? And there are other people who are reasonably secure who can say, go ahead and do what you like with your life. I have no plans for the way you should behave. I feel that that is your decision.
Yes, well said. I love the idea of changing song lyrics for the Flat Earthers. There must be other possibilities. There's a song called "There's a Big Wide Wonderful World." Do you change that to "A Big Long Wonderful World"? A Big Square Wonderful. That is, there are people on this earth, we won't say what shape the earth is, who still believe it is flat in all seriousness, or they're a sort of parody group.
Well, many of them are in the cabinet. Well, that was cheap, and I
That was
apologize.
cheap, yeah.
There's
I'm
only
sure
two.
if they hear about that, they would sail over here, except they'd be afraid of falling off, wouldn't they? And get you. Well, John, we haven't even scratched your surface. And I'm sorry, because I promised the viewers that I would someday get you here and scratch your surface severely. So what we're going to have to do is sit here for approximately 24 hours. And then, dressed exactly this way, tomorrow night we will continue really giving your surface a good scratching. Would that be all right?
That's lovely.
Okay, we'll see you. It's John Cleese and I will see you right here tomorrow night. We might as well just rest now until then. That's the thread. Oh. Oh, you look at this. You slept in your clothes. I mean, if you saw last night's show, John Cleese and I decided that we hadn't scratched his surface, and we just sat here and waited 24 hours. And don't you get it, folks? Anyway, this is part 2 of an interview with John Cleese, best known to you perhaps as part of Monty Python's Flying Circus. And last night we talked a good bit about the film The Life of Brian, which seems to have something to offend everyone, although I think that might be, again, what we said last night, a false impression of it, that if people hadn't been told they were going to be offended, maybe a lot fewer people would have been. I've only read it, but it reads so funny. Well, I can wait to see it. I was going to say I can't wait to see it. But we should examine some of these cliches.
Yes. I wouldn't want to give the impression, in fact, that many of the people who go into the cinema seem to be offended by it. I mean, the heads of organizations certainly have been, and 150 people demonstrated last Sunday. But I actually went to see it last night. And 3 people did walk out, but it was after the opening credits.
You didn't like those somehow?
So I don't think that can have been offense, but otherwise everyone enjoyed it. We've had people watching, watching the audiences, sitting in there, seeing what's happening. And I think the offense is what a friend of mine who once ran a BBC department called public offense. And I had a talk with him on the plane over here about this whole thing, and he said when you really offend people, they tend to come up to you privately, and they express their offense really quite gently, but you really feel uncomfortable afterwards because you really do feel you've upset someone. He said there's also what they call institutional offense, which is, and he had a lot of this, as I say, running a department at the BBC, which is people complaining because they're the heads of organizations and they feel that their members will complain to them if they don't complain. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I can see that they would go to a screening of it and think, well, now, if we don't say anything about this, we're liable to be criticized. So then they become offended officially. Yeah.
But it's so much to do with the type of mind, because, I mean, one of the, I hate to say messages, but one of the themes in the film is do make up your own mind about things and don't do what people tell you. And I find it slightly funny that there are now religious organizations saying, do not go and see this film that tells you not to do what you were told.
What percentage of the increase in the box office would you say you owe gratitude to these people who've been offended for? If you see what I mean?
Phenomenal.
They've done a wonderful...
They have actually made me rich. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I hope they're satisfied.
Well, I feel we should send them something, like a crate of champagne or something, but there's no question. I mean, I think originally the movie might have gone into 200 movie houses. And once the protests started, it was soon decided to put it into 600.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah,
So it is
good.
wonderful when people embark on a course of action that they can really achieve something so totally counterproductive. You know, one can only think that either they're profoundly stupid, and these people are obviously not, but either that or they become so enraged that they are incapable of thinking. Because obviously, if you don't want people to see a movie, the thing to do is to just let it quietly die away, get a tiny little review on the movie page, and nobody knows about it. But if you do want to make a success of a movie, I've learned this trip, you want to get people cross and angry and protesting. It's extraordinary.
Now you'll have people thinking that maybe these protests have actually come from pythons in disguise who knew it would make the movie a success. And
It's been suggested.
That will offend people too.
Well, we had an idea for a premiere that I think they eventually cancelled, partly because Warner Brothers said to us, well, look, I'm afraid after all the protesting, you don't have to do 10 days publicity in New York, you only have to do 3 days. So that was really quite nice from our point of view, but we also did have a premiere arranged in which we were going to get the lady who looks just like the Queen, Jeanette Charles, I think it was going to come along. We have a figure from one of the Python shows called the pantomime Princess Margaret, who is a 9-foot reproduction of Princess Margaret. And we were going to have them arrive for a pantomime royal premiere at the movie house, and we were going to have cardboard cutouts of great stars like Paul Newman and Frank Sinatra standing in the lobby with us, and they were going to come in, and I think Warner Brothers at that point felt that having offended the majority of the religious groups that we shouldn't also go for the monarchists, so that was dropped. We suggested that, incidentally, as the premiere for the last movie in England. We suggested this, and guess what the guy did?
What?
He rang up Buckingham Palace to ask if it would be all right.
Which, in fact, ought to be a sketch on your show.
That's wonderful.
Oh, well, did he get anyone to reply?
They suggested it would not be all right.
What's the difference between suggesting it would not and saying it would not? That's a nice, fine point there.
Well, they have this down to a T. I mean, the royal family really have a great deal of power in England, but it's exercised very, very gently. I mean, there is a story. I better be quite careful about this. There's a very well-known and very excellent English actor who was at a dinner on one occasion. And when a very senior and well-known royal person got up, not the Queen, to make a speech, he shouted such things as "take 'em off" and "sit down."
Show us your muscles.
He didn't work for about 6 years.
What did he actually have in mind in doing that?
Well, that I don't think we've ever gone into.
Refreshing about people who will do it. John, how much, certainly having studied law, as we say, or I believe you say read law,
that's right,
must have stood you in wonderful stead, as we also say in comedy. What does the one have to do with the other? Anything at all?
Oh, dear, that's awful. I can't trot out one of my prepared answers to that. I think that it has always struck me that my strength and the strength of the guy that I write with on Python, Graham Chapman, has been that we have a very strong logic. And I think people often think when you're writing crazy sketches that it's just a question of being crazy. Whereas in fact what it is, you choose your crazy premises and then you must stick to that logic absolutely rigidly. So I suppose the kind of logical thinking that I got from studying law and before that from science, because Graham was also science-based, he was a doctor, I think that's always helped us to keep the logic in our pieces very tight. So one could say that. Also, of course, it gives you a considerable interest in words. I find myself looking up words the whole time. But that's the only real connection. I mean, once I had a chance not to be a lawyer, I
You leapt at it, did you?
straight away.
What possessed you to think you wanted to be one in the first place, then, with this strong performing...
Well, you see, I came from the smallest of small-town folk, from Weston-super-Mare, on the west coast of England, just down the coast from Bristol.
You know, I thought Weston-super-Mare in your credits or your resume was a joke. There is such a name.
There really is such a name. There was a Roman encampment there 2,000 years ago, and super-mare is super mare, means on the sea, so some Latin influence still pertains. But anyway, the thing about that town was it was as tiny and small town as possible. Arts were completely non-existent, except perhaps from a few people who would go and put Beethoven records on, but that's as far as it would go. And I never had the slightest idea that I would come into the business at all, and I still find it's a bit of a surprise to be in it. And the only thing that I can attribute it to at all was my father did have a great sense of humor, and a great sense of cliche, and a very biting wit, which he hid under a rather pleasant, polite English exterior, because the English are vicious, you know, but if they're very polite with it, people often don't pick it up. And that's the only connection I can get. But I somehow got into it simply because I was offered $50 to $60 a week as a writer when I left university, as opposed to the $18 a week I would have got as a lawyer.
Can you politely turn people down at parties who say, oh, do the silly walk that you did as the minister of the Bureau of Silly Walks, or whatever the title is?
Yes.
I mean, if I were to get you to go up and do it now, would you be able to politely turn me down?
I think so, yes.
Yes.
That particular sketch is, you know when you do something and it catches on and everybody likes it, and then for the next 8 years, as you creep out of your house at 8:30 in the morning, oi, do your funny walks then, John. It's just so painful.
Yeah, of course. Remind us of how it looks here. No, you don't have to do it until later. John, there are other interests that the other Pythons have. Is one of you a doctor, even as Jonathan Miller?
That's right. Graham Chapman's a doctor.
Yeah.
Terry Jones, who directed the Life of Brian, has just written a book about Chaucer. And all the rest of us mess around with comedy in one form or another.
Can you think afterwards, when you see things you've done in the past, can you remember who thought of what? I know this is a dangerous game to play among writers, but for example, what is it you have in which a network executive says the public are idiots and someone says they're not, and he opens the window and points outside, and there are people stumbling into holes and banging into walls and so on, verifying his book. A thing like that, can you ever remember who thought of it or how it came about? Or what?
It's incredible how difficult it is. Just occasionally you can say, yes, that's very much so-and-so sketch. But then what happened as Python went on is we started to parody each other's styles.
You influence each other.
Yes, because I discovered that Terry Jones and Mike Palin always used to start the thing off in a very imposing and dramatic way with a camera panning across beautiful countryside and dramatic music. And then a drama would start, but just after it got going, somebody would have an argument with somebody about where they put their hammer. You see what I mean?
Yes, that's
and the whole impetus would get lost in this argument.
Yeah.
And so I remember Graham and I writing a thing on a highwayman who held people up and warned them, and then got into a whole prolonged thing about whether he could, you know, how good a shot he was. He could hit that tree. Well, when he says he could hit that tree, he could hit it 7 times out of, well, take that tree there, he could hit that 9 times out of 10, and let's say it was a windy day, 7 times out of 10. So that he got into this kind of thing, and that was just parodying their style. And our style was Graham and I had a style, myself had a style apparently that consists of people abusing each other for long periods, and this Mike and Terry started to write. So when you get into late Python, none of us could remember who wrote what.
Is it typical of some one of you to think of a man returning a parrot because of the complaint that the parrot is dead? Hence the famous dead parrot sketch. Is that specifically one person's sense of humor as opposed to anyone else's? Is that idea?
I can tell you exactly how we got to that. Graham and I had written a sketch about a man taking a second-hand car back. And the doors fell off and all that. And we said, this is so corny, you know, second-hand cars, what can we do? And I suggested that it should be a pet shop. And Graham said, how about a dog? He drags the dog in and says it doesn't work, you see. And then I thought, I had a feeling that a parrot was funny because a parrot can talk, you know. And then that was how we got to it. And we wrote that sketch 3 times, and it wasn't until we got the shopkeeper right. My lines were always the same, but Mike Palin, who played the shopkeeper, the sketch never worked until we got Mike's lines right.
Some people would be surprised that you work the things out that much. They might think it's all improvised, or they just go out there and do whatever comes to mind. It's certainly not that.
It's, I mean, the improvisation we always feel should take place during the rehearsal period. I mean, that's the time. You know, why improvise in front of the audience? They've paid money, you know.
There's a lot of verbal humor and a lot of visual humor. I don't know if the verbal comes from some of you and the visual from the other. It doesn't make much difference. But those are 2 very different kinds of humor, and so there's something for everybody in them. For example, is it in something I just read, maybe it's a script in the movie where someone confuses the word faithless sex with...
Ah, yes, that was in there. Yes, that was in
false sex, S-E-C-T-S, with forced sex,
that's
S-E-X.
right.
And there's a terrible misunderstanding between the 2 of them.
That's right, which gets the whole audience interested,
Would be,
Yes, that was the point of it. No, I mean, 2 or 3 of us are very verbal. I'm fairly verbal. Eric is even more verbal than I am. And then we have an American who can hardly speak, who is almost completely visual. You know, if he wants anything, he has to draw a picture of it.
Who's that?
Terry Gilliam.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Terry talks. And he only has 2. He only has 2 phrases, as I've said before. He says, "Yeah, I really like that," which is, "Yes, I really like that."
Oh yeah.
Or he says, "Oh, it really pisses me off," which is, "That really pisses me off." And the entire whole of human life is divided into, you know. The Inquisition, for example, really pisses him off.
Oh, yeah, well, there's something offends everyone, doesn't it? Can't even have an Inquisition without getting some people. It is good to have someone around, though, who does occasionally like something and says it's good, and so you're probably very grateful to him for that.
They don't seem to write in.
What? Why don't we look at a piece of film or tape that you have? Could you set this up for us a bit?
Well, yes. In order to provide for my old age, I accepted an offer from a friend about 5 years ago, no more, 7 years ago, to form a company with him, which we call Video Arts. And these films are intended to train people how to deal with, let's say, how to deal with a complaint, how to run a meeting more efficiently, how to take a decision, all this kind of thing. And we sell them and hire them, believe it or not, to quite serious and proper folk in industry and the civil service. And this one's from a film about secretaries, how a secretary and the boss have got to get their relationship right. And I think this is about the problems if one secretary has not kept her diary corresponding to her boss's diary.
Yeah. But roll that and let's see what problem that creates.
It's very, very good.
We'll be the judge of it.
An appointment, yes, certainly. Can you tell me what it's about? I see. Would 11:30 tomorrow morning be convenient? Good. And are there any particular papers that you'd like him to have with him?
Sorry to keep you, Mr. Turner. Can we make it 2:30? No, not 2:30. How about 3:30?
I've made an appointment for you to see Mr. Sankster of JWN at 11:30 here tomorrow morning. That's all right, isn't it?
Yes, that's okay. 4:15? You can't make 4:15. How about 5 o'clock? 5 o'clock would be fine with me. And with you, but not with me, I'm afraid. Well, it looks like 10:30 on Wednesday. You can? 10:30 Wednesday? Are you sure? No! Oh, mate.
What do you want to talk about?
I don't know, he didn't say. Now, 10:30 Wednesday, make a note of it.
Where?
In your appointments diary?
You put it in yours.
But there's no point in having 2 diaries if they don't tally.
Why should you want to know when I'm having my hair tinted? Hello?
What do you do with it?
Oh,
What do you do with
thank
it?
you very much.
I don't know.
What can we learn from that? You've also done, I'm not going to ask you to describe it, but on a favorite subject of mine, I think you could safely say that almost all meetings are dispensable.
Oh, yes.
And probably the greatest waste of time in any business.
Well,
Anyway,
I
and you
became intolerable with the Python group because one of our other films called Meetings, Bloody Meetings was exactly about that. And I suddenly realized that there is no point of getting together just because you always have a meeting, you know? And I got very stroppy with the Python group and said, look, I really don't want to come in until I know what we're discussing and why we're discussing it and whether we need a decision. And everybody thought I was being very awkward, and they now actually really rather like it because we do get through meetings in about a third of the time and cancel the ones that we don't need.
You've done a service.
I hope so.
I wonder why it never occurs to, let's say, network executives, either there or here, to hire someone like yourself to run a television network. Once it's been shown that you can command an audience, and you have some sense and some good breeding and so on, all the other things they would require. But nobody like that ever becomes an executive. I don't know why that is. Would you want the job? Would you like to head up the BBC? If you...
No, but the BBC, in fact, often have people going from programs to heading departments. And then they go back to production again afterwards, which is quite interesting. They
Haven't
don't
gone
just
too
keep...
far.
No, in fact, they get there, they do it for enough, and then they want to go back to production. And I think that there's a club in England called the Cincinnatus Club, after the Roman emperor who stopped being emperor and went back to his farm. And they have a club with a little tie, and they're all the guys who've become executives and then have said, right, that's enough of that, and have gone back to making programs, which is their first love.
I think that probably would happen to me. I know a very funny comedy writer who stands on his constitutional right not to be made a producer, which is supposed to be more desirable in every way. But why Tunis? Why did you do Life of Brian in Tunis? Had you always wanted to see Tunis?
No.
I just...
Have you ever been there?
No, but it apparently looks more biblical than the Holy Land or
Oh, it's
something.
wonderful. There is also the worst hotel in the world.
Well, I thought I had found it, but I'm willing to be convinced.
Where is yours?
Well, I've been in several, and isn't this awful? At the moment, all I can think of is they change the sheets every day from one room to another, which is a line I either wrote or stole years ago.
Well, we stayed in the Hotel Oasis in Gabez.
Well, from the
G-A-B,
name, you'd think it would be
yeah.
wonderful.
It's really, I went to the front desk just after I got there, and I said to the man in my appalling French, excuse me, there's no glass in my room. And he said proudly, there are no glasses in any of the rooms. So I said, well, could I have one? And he said, why? I said, well, I have a sore throat, I want to take a pill. And he said, get one from the bar. And that was the first 2 minutes there. And it went on like that with the two most malevolent breakfast waiters I've ever come across.
Is it possible someone was putting you on, thinking, let's see how much of this they'll take before they...
Because they were the only hotel in town, you see, so they were in that monopoly situation, like the English telephone service, you know.
Yes, that seems to be true of telephone companies in general. They don't really have enough competition. John, do you have any, it's a boring old question, but are there any living or dead comic idols of yours? Do you feel you've modeled yourself on or been influenced by anybody in particular when you see
I think it's very difficult to tell who you've been influenced by, but the funny thing is that 3/4 of the comics that I really adore have been American, either American or like Chaplin and Laurel, you know, worked here. And you go back to all the same names. Harpo Marx, I think, is a genius. W.C. Fields, Keaton. Oliver Hardy, I think, is underrated. I think he's wonderful. And then coming up into sort of post-war, all the really funny stuff on English television in the mid-30s was Burns and Allen. George Burns, I think, is a wonderful comic.
And claims not to be one, but to be a straight man. Which
I know.
Of course,
I think he's just wonderful.
yeah.
And then there are one or two English like Spike Milligan. I don't know if your viewers are aware of Spike, but he did the Goon Show, which very much was our forerunner.
Yeah.
Peter Cook?
Sure.
Yeah?
Cook would be someone you... are you younger than Cook?
Slightly, 2 years.
Now, all of the Monty Pythons were at Harvard, at Harvard, sorry about that. We're at Cambridge and the other place,
Right.
Oxford and Cambridge, but we're not brought together until the BBC.
That's, well, there was a kind of golden period at Cambridge. It was very odd, and it sometimes happens this way, doesn't it? That over a period of 4 or 5 years, one particular institution suddenly produces a lot of people who are really good at comedy, and we had about 5 years of it, starting with Jonathan Miller, through Peter Cook and Monty Python. Oxford, on the other hand, they're a very feeble, shambolic lot. I don't know if you've ever met them. They wear hairy jackets, and they always turn up late. They're very...
those people are in those hairy jackets. They're Oxford people.
They're Oxford people, yes. They're very pleasant. They're very... But don't ask them to do anything, you know.
I wouldn't dream of it.
Oh, that's not what I'd heard.
Well, what will happen now with the Monty Python group? Will it continue to be film, or do you still go on stage from now and then? I know you played New York on the stage. And
that's, we've got lazier and lazier, and I'm also I'm terrible about repetition now. I mean, you go on stage, yes. I mean, I really think it's wonderful that actors are prepared to go on stage each night and do it again and again and again. I think it's extraordinary. But bless them, because otherwise writers wouldn't make a living. But it's certainly nothing that I want to do. And I mean, acting in a film is horrible because you have to get up early. And you have to have makeup put and all these uncomfortable things. But you do get a whole series of quite exciting little problems to solve each day. Whereas, as I say, and television in England is awful because the whole thing is made in such a terrible rush. I mean, something like 40 Towers, it's made in a day in the studio, and it is always a desperate last-minute improvisation, and at the end of the day, the triumph is to have got the thing finished. If it's any good, it's a bonus. See what I mean?
Congratulate yourselves on getting through it.
Yes, you actually did the show. Yeah.
I read your resume, and at one point you were... had a journalistic career going in America. You worked for Newsweek.
That's right.
And in your resume, it simply says, employed by Newsweek, whatever the date, failed, period, resigned, period. Are there spicy details to that we should know about?
Well, not really. I just couldn't do it. I mean, I would love to have become a journalist, and it was about international affairs which interested me, and a lovely guy called Everett Martin, whom I should call before I go back to London, got me the job. And then, unfortunately, he was taken away from the office, and I needed somebody really to say, don't say it like that. You know, I needed a mentor, somebody to teach me, and I couldn't do it. And I was a little ashamed, and I'd wasted their money, and I liked Bob Christopher, the editor, very much, and I said, I just wrote a little note before I was fired, you know.
And left and never went back to journalism?
Quickly, straight off.
Yeah. Now, what will you do when you go back? Will you start... when you're back to England, will you start...
Well, I'm trying not to work, quite seriously, because I've done 15 years of hard work, and I just thought it would be lovely to have a completely fallow period.
You were 30
very difficult.
You were 30 when this began. You're 40
That's right.
now. Do you see yourself as a Python at 50?
It's an awful thought, isn't it?
Is it?
Sort of aged, greying men dressed as chickens, you know?
Well, if you had to go to, say, an English-speaking country where they had never heard of the Pythons and you wanted to show them their best shot or anything you've been connected with in television, would it be Fawlty Towers? Would it be the Parrot sketch? Do you have a favorite?
I do love the Parrot sketch. It's the one thing each night on stage I was able to look forward to. And it was very nice because the Python audiences are very strange. And I remember doing it at Drury Lane one night with Michael, and I really loved performing with Michael. He's a really wonderful guy to be. You know, the timing is terrific. And we often break up on stage, and I remember I broke up and got my face straight and suddenly realized I had no idea where I was, none at all. And it being the relaxed occasion that it was, I turned to the front row and I said, what's the next line? And about 4 of them gave it to me. Yes. So I said the line, and that got a laugh.
You know you have hold of a classic at that point. Well, John, we didn't really mutilate your surface, but we scratched it a little bit tonight, and it was wonderful having you here.
Really enjoyed it.
You're pleasantly unfunny and delightfully funny, and that's a wonderful combination. That was supposed to come out as a compliment. We'll, while his blush is going down, we'll say goodnight, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Night.
Public television's cooking star, Julia Child, joins Dick tomorrow at this time. 30 minutes from now, join us for the McNeil Lear Report, right after Over Easy.